Hello, it's me, Stephen, the priest again, here with my dog, Shakira, and also with our parishioner, Greg Mura. And we're going to talk about our church and race and our community in general. But before we get to that important topic, Greg, I wanted to first forgive you for wearing merchandise from the San Francisco 49ers. As you know, Jesus is a Seahawks fan, and so you too have some growth to do.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that Jesus was disappointed the last game of the season last year, but there's always a new year, I guess, to get your hopes up.
You may recall that in the New Testament, when the Holy Spirit appears, it is a bird out of the sky, like a Seahawk, not a gold digger in the mountains. All right, now that we've settled that, Greg, I want to talk to you today because Christ Episcopal Church is wrestling with race in our community right now, and we are making an effort to listen to voices that are not traditionally dominant in our church. As I like to joke, Christ Episcopal Church, well, any Episcopal church is the most diverse group of middle-class white people I've ever encountered, but you don't fall into that demographic. Can you tell us some about your background and how you got here?
Sure. So I'm of Japanese descent. I'm fourth generation. I think both sides of the family came to the U.S. around the turn of the century, 1902 or 1903. My paternal grandmother used to talk about, or she used to talk to me about the 1906 earthquake before.
Wow.
So they were in the Bay Area, although they settled towards Stockton area. And I grew up in San Mateo and attended St. Matthew's in San Mateo. That was predominantly, I think there was one other Asian family in the church, and then the rest was white, I think.
And do you know what led your great grandparents to leave Japan and come this way?
So on my mom's side, it was my great grandmother came over, and there was some sort of it's sort of hard to get the dirty side of the story with family members, but there was some sort of disagreement or something, and they lived in the northern part of Honshu, which is the main island of Japan, and so she came over with her kids without her husband, which was sort of unheard of in
Wow.
the time, obviously. I'm not really sure why on my dad's side why they came over, but again, it was around the same time.
Right. And from the stories you heard from your family, do you have any sense for what their experience of being Japanese in the Bay Area was like back at the turn of the last century?
Yeah, so there weren't many Japanese in the area, obviously. There were a lot of Chinese at the time, as we know. Both of my grandfathers went to Cal, and on my dad's side, actually both, they didn't have a whole lot of money, either family, particularly to go to school. And I've heard stories where he would, like, even taking care of his clothes. He didn't have a lot of clothes, so he had to, in those days, he sort of dressed up to go to school and everything. So he would put sort of a damp cloth over his pants when he was ironing them so they wouldn't get shiny and it would sort of last longer and things. So he really had kind of a hard time, with books and everything and going to school. And, paying for it also was a challenge. On my mom's side, my grandfather worked at he was sort of like a butler type thing at this rich white family's home up in Berkeley Hills.
Wow.
So he did that while he was going to school, and he was a Phi Beta Kappa at Cal. And when he told the family, they didn't believe him, and said, "There's no way that some stupid foreigner is going to get Phi Beta Kappa," And so he actually he showed them the key, this Phi Beta Kappa key, and they still didn't believe him.
Wow.
And I think he had a degree in it was like electrical engineering. I don't know what it was called then, but he couldn't get a job anywhere. So he ended up being a gardener. He ended up in Santa Cruz, and he was a gardener, and he was really bitter about that all his life. He really felt like the work that he did just wasn't what he wanted to do or felt like he could be doing. But that's kind of the way it was. So they didn't want you at work, and there weren't many, obviously, minorities at Cal at the time. Also,
Right.
So.
Wow. Switching gears a little bit from that, I gather that your family has some harrowing stories from the World War II era as well. Would you mind sharing some of those?
Sure. So my dad's side of the family, they originally they were put into Tule Lake, and then that became the camp for relocation or repatriation. People that wanted to go back to Japan, or the people that they felt shouldn't be in the U.S., they put them all in Tule Lake. So they moved them to Topaz. So they spent most of their time in Topaz. My mom's side of the family were posted down in Arizona the whole time, and actually they spent some time in Tan Fran, the shopping center in San Bruno.
Wow.
So it used to be a racetrack. If you go there, right in the front of the mall, there's a marker that talks about the Japanese Americans that were held there.
Huh.
So while the camps were being built, they sort of staged them there. So every family got a horse stall. So they were living in a horse stall for a while until the camp was ready, and then they put them on a train and took them down to Arizona.
How long were they interned?
So my dad said to get out a little earlier. So near the end, they were allowing them to leave if you stayed away from the West Coast.
Huh.
So they were, I don't know the exact year. It was pretty close to the end of the war, but they ended up in Chicago for a while. And then eventually, when they were allowed to, they moved back. My mom's side of the family, they had a house in Santa Cruz. And they had a white family that they knew that said that they would take care of the house. So that was actually somewhat helpful, because everyone knew that they were being forced to go to camps.
Right.
So they tried to have yard sales. I mean, think about it. Think about if you were told you've got a month and you're out and you can only take what you can carry. You know, you're going to have garage sales trying to sell your washer and dryer and things like that in your car. But everybody knew they were leaving, so no one did anything. And then when they left, they just took it. So, my mom's family, their house, they actually had a pretty large plot of land, and so they were growing things, and they had a strawberry crop that was just about ready to go, and then they had to leave. And so that was all cleaned out by the family that rented the house. Picked all the strawberries and sold them, and I think there were some things are missing in the house when they eventually got back. But they were actually fortunate that they had someone that could kind of take care of their property while they were gone, whereas most other people just lost everything.
Wow. And they got it back?
They got the house back.
The house back.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you know from their stories what life in the camps was like?
It was, I don't know if you've seen pictures of it, but it's, most of them are sort of out in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple down in, I think, Arkansas, Rower, and there's another one, but most of them were sort of the western area, I guess. My mom remembers it being unbelievably hot down in Poston, and the places they lived in, sort of the barracks was, just sort of a frame and some thin pieces of wood and some tar paper over it, and that was it. So you didn't really, there's no such thing as air conditioning or anything. At Tule Lake, they because they were people that wanted to repatriate, they had Japanese school, whereas the other camps, most of them I don't believe had Japanese schools, but they tried to sort of make the most of it. They were allowed to work for, I think it was about, let's see, $5 a day. I remember my uncle or my grandmother on my dad's side, they had one of the peachy jobs was in like the office or something, and they made $19 a month.
Wow.
So it was, you were just sort of, it wasn't a whole lot to do, and they tried to sort of make the best of it. But for all intents and purposes, it was a prison camp. If you tried to leave, you get shot. There were people that got fall over. There were people that got shot trying to escape, and
High quality furniture here.
trouble. So, I mean, a lot of people say that it was done for their protection, which is absolute BS. And but again, it wasn't. I mean, it was definitely a prison camp.
What kind of mark did that leave on them after they got out? How did that change their sense of the United States, their sense of their place here?
My parents didn't really talk about it a whole lot. And my mother probably talked about it a little bit. My grandmother on my mom's side talked about it a lot. But it wasn't, I mean, it was to them, I mean, the civil rights movement hadn't happened yet. And I think a lot of people, particularly in my mom's generation, probably gave the people that were adults at the time a hard time. Like, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you do anything? And it just wasn't heard of. There were 3 wartime cases that went to the Supreme Court, and there's one afterwards. I think it was like 85 or something, 86. But it was just, I think people were probably more ashamed of it than anything else.
What impact do you think it's had on you, knowing that your family went through that?
They did the reparations, and I think it was called the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. And, there's a big debate about how much, what did people really lose? And a lot of people felt like they shouldn't get anything because they, it was wartime and, all that kind of stuff. I realized after President Obama left office, and then we had these discussions about the Muslim ban and things like that, and they were using Executive Order 9066, which was signed to put them in the camps, as justification for the Muslim ban.
Wow.
And it actually came up in Trump versus Hawaii, which was the state that challenged the Muslim ban outright. And the Supreme Court, of course, supported Trump in that, and they had an opportunity to overturn, I think it was the Korematsu case, because that was sort of linked to it, but they said it was too different. And I think Justice Roberts said he acknowledges that it wasn't a great thing, but he didn't overturn it. So those cases are still Supreme Court precedents right now, and it's a concern of mine because it comes up, and I was actually really surprised, and I know Stephen Miller's brought it up several times. He's wanted to jail Muslims early on in Trump's presidency, but for something like that to be used as precedent, it should be overturned. It's just, it bothers me, and it kind of makes me feel like nothing's really changed.
Right.
Right, and the U.S. has paid reparations, so everything's good. You have nothing more to complain about, but we'll still let these cases stand.
Wow. Well, speaking of change and whether or not things have changed, I'm wondering if you could tell me about your experience as a Japanese person coming into a church a few years ago that is mostly white. How did you, what was your experience of race here at this church?
I not just at church here, but at work and school and just sort of everywhere you go, you sort of learn how to deal with racism, whether it's microaggressions or for Asians it's the model minority, things like that. And so, for me, I already know that when I walk into a room, if people don't know me, then every stereotype applies.
Mm-hmm.
and that's sort of ground zero for me with a lot of people. Is like, well, if we need to settle a check, Greg's good at math, right?
But the thing is, you're actually terrible at math, I hear.
Well, I'm good enough to make everyone else overpay, but other than that, it's not going to work out too good. But anyhow, so I don't want to say don't fault everybody for it. That's just sort of the way things are, and that's sort of how I've had to deal with everything. And I decided a long time ago that that's not a burden I want to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
It's really not my responsibility. So, I don't want to be the guy that has to prove that it's okay to be friends with an Asian, or that we're okay to be with, or whatever. So I don't really kind of let that bother me.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to this church for a reason. I appreciated the outreach, and it's a very loving community, and but I think it's hard. I mean, it's ingrained in people to expect people to be a certain way, and maybe you can say that about someone says I'm from New York. Maybe you have certain preconceived notions about how it's going to be interacting with them. So I haven't really haven't felt like I've been pushed out or excluded or anything here, and it's been a very good experience for me here.
Greg, when you say you don't want to carry that burden, what does that mean practically? How do you put something down that other people are projecting onto you?
I think you have to be your true self, and I am really careful about me having preconceived notions about people that I meet,
Mm-hmm.
Whether they be white, black, whatever. I sort of give everyone a clean slate, and then we figure it out after that. And I think that's a Christian way to behave, and to the example to set for people. And I think if you sort of allow your the stereotypes to sort of lead the way you interact with people, I think that's it's going to be a problem. And but again, for me, I just sort of you just sort of have to deal with it. And I get a lot of microaggressions at work, and I don't let it slide. And there are situations where if I do see things at work that I don't think is right, I will speak up. And particularly in technology, where you have software making decisions about things,
Mm-hmm.
who to hire, who to even bring into hiring. That the machine learning, they call it, or artificial intelligence, and that's all created by people. So you have to really be careful and really understand what you're doing when you're doing things like that, because you can inadvertently exclude people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's an awareness that particularly at work, because I'm in software, it's important for me to bring up. But I am aware of things that happen, and I do speak up when I feel I need to.
Sure. Wow. Well, Greg, given your experience as a Japanese American and your family's history, what challenge would you give to Christ Church about race? How can we grow into a more inclusive place?
I mentioned this a few weeks ago when I talked in church, but I think it's really important, and this is something I learned recently as well, is you really have to take the time to understand the impacts to people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times sort of the tipping point for me was the Philando Castile incident. And if you watch those videos, and this is a repeat of what I talked about on Sunday, but if you watch those videos, I can't imagine, and try to picture yourself in that situation. I can't even imagine that. And the 4-year-old girl is going to be scarred for life, dealing with that, watching her dad get shot right in front of her, and how is she gonna deal with that? And I think you have to get to that level, and also really, we know about Philando Castile because he died, and it was filmed. This happens all the time in the black communities, and I can't imagine walking around and every time a cop car comes by, I'm thinking, oh my God, I might get stopped for no reason, and the cops can sort of have bad behavior, and the worst thing that happens is they might lose their job. Worst thing that might happen to you is you can get shot. So no matter how irritated or you're late for a meeting or whatever you're doing, and you have to stop and get your time wasted with these sort of silly situations, you have to behave, and I think that's kind of what I think is important for us as a community is to take that extra step. I think if something makes you uncomfortable, I think you need to think about that. Why is it making you uncomfortable? You can certainly walk away from it and say, well, you know what, it's not my problem, and to me that's white privilege. And because there's lots of people that are heavily affected by it. And I know people say, well, Asians aren't affected as much, you guys are integrated, and of course that's sort of the model minority thing, but we do carry a lot of that as well.
Right.
How we have to behave. I've been pulled over in San Mateo several times for no reason, and I had to talk to my son about it because he's been pulled over a couple of times by the sheriffs, and he's kind of like me in a lot of ways, where he's got a lot of things to say sometimes, but he's got to just keep it to himself until he can get out of that situation, because it's really not safe.
Well, Greg, I want to thank you for your time today and for sharing these stories.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it, and I think it's really important for people like me and for our church to hear stories from people's experiences that we don't share. So thank you so much.
Okay.
With that, let's sign off, and I think we can agree to say go Seahawks as we say farewell to people.
We just won't say where.